Hi, and welcome to this Voxeurop Live with Ukrainian writer Andrei Kurkov. Before introducing Andrei for today's conversation, let me also thank very warmly Voxeurop's members for their support, which enables us to remain independent. And if you're not a member yet, we're looking forward to your support. Okay, so to start, we have a tradition at Voxeurop. Could you please just tell us in the chat in which city or country you're right now? And we are recording this event so as to prepare a shorter version that will be published on Voxeurop's website and on YouTube this week, we hope. So I'm Catherine. I'm a editorial director and co-founder of Voxeurop, and I'm based in Paris.
Hello and welcome to this discussion conversation with Andrei Kurkov with us today. I'm Gian-Paolo Accardo, editor-in-chief and co-founder of Voxeurop. So Andrei, you are one of Ukraine's most prolific and eclectic writers. You're a Russian speaker, at least when you were born, and you have covered several themes linked to Ukraine's recent history, especially after the 2004 Orange Revolution, as well as several thriller stories, some almost surrealistic, set in the years that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union. Your most famous novel is Death and the Penguin, from 2002. You wrote also a series of essays on the events unfolding in Ukraine since the Maidan Revolution of 2013-14. Ukraine Diaries, The Diary of an Invasion, and lastly, Our Daily War, which was published in English at the end of last year. We also published a conversation we had with Andrea Pipino at Internazionales Festival in Ferrara in last October.
So Andrei, maybe you want to have a first word before I ask the
thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to have this conversation. I'm for this week in Paris, and then I'll go to Poland for 2 days and back to Kyiv. I am launching now the French edition of the second book about the life during the war in Ukraine. Notre guerre quotidienne, that's the French version of the same book that was published in London. It will be also out soon in some other countries. Yes, I mean, we are now finding ourselves in a very crucial moment of this war, not because of the anniversary, the third year of full-scale war anniversary and 11th year of the war with Russia from the moment of annexation of Crimea.
We both asked ourselves, Gian-Paolo and I, what's the state of mind today of Ukrainians and your state of mind at this precise moment that you described?
I'm very worried, as well as probably majority of Ukrainians. I mean, emotionally, we had very difficult times from the moment of American elections in November last year. So, I mean, first, Ukrainians were very upset by the results and pessimistic because, Trump is not somebody who is a symbol of goodwill, honesty, and justice. So Ukrainians were thinking that actually Trump will abandon Ukraine, unlike Biden, and will pay less attention to the war, and there will be stop to military aid from the American side. Then there was some kind of hope because obviously Trump was not happy with Putin and with Russia, and there were probably some secret talks going on. And as the result, on Russian TV, on Russian national TV, the photos of half-naked Melania Trump, Trump's wife, of the time when she was a model, were circulated and discussed, probably in order to intimidate Trump's administration. And so that, strangely enough, gave a hope that the Trump will still support Ukraine in this war. And now, after Trump's friendly conversation on the telephone with Putin on the 13th of February, of course, there was this sign of new despair in Ukraine, because this conversation sounded more like a talk between two business partners than a conversation between the head of the world democracy and the head of the country, which is the aggressor and authoritarian country. So today, I mean, we are all worried in Ukraine, and we are following the events, and we are watching closely what is happening now in Riyadh and what will happen in the next 2-3 weeks.
Well, what is the feeling in Ukraine now and among Ukrainians about this new unfolding of events and this new attitude of what maybe Ukrainians believe as being their major ally, the US specifically?
Well, first of all, it is a disappointment, and the understanding that America is very different from 20th of January. And Ukraine will have to redefine its attitude in Ukrainians towards today's America without actually calling America an enemy or being aggressively upset. I mean, this is a new reality. Trump is a businessman. He is not a statesman in the large sense of this word. He doesn't want to be as much as involved in geopolitics as the previous presidents were. He wants to concentrate on American economy. And I think this is the American economy now, which is the driving force in the possible negotiations. Because, I mean, the contract that the head of the Treasury of the US tried to get signed by Zelensky during Munich conference, it was a business contract according to which practically Ukraine had to give 50% of all the resources it has to America in exchange of not really what, either in repayment for the help which was already organized before, or for some kind of protection in the future. But as we know, there was no guarantee of security in this contract. There were no promises of new military aid. There was only demand to share the mineral resources, the rare earth metals and other things, and even to pay 50% of the money received from the licenses given to companies that will develop these resources later, if they are not American companies, I assume.
How about Europe? I mean, does it still have a place, you think, in the game of Ukraine security and future reconstruction or not? Or
I think actually European Union remains the only grand partner of Ukraine in this war. So America is now downgrading its role, and so the hopes of Ukrainians are connected with the European Union, but at the same time, Europe looks weaker after the Munich conference, after the Vance speech, where he questioned actually the ability of Europe to be strong and to be democratic, and where he promoted extreme right political views and parties. So I think Europe has still to digest what happened in Munich, and should get together and decide how to develop new strategy, knowing that America is of no help anymore.
There are 3 questions actually in the audience, so I will ask them now. There's one from Brigitte Ramboussek. Brigitte is in Vienna, or maybe not in Vienna today, but she's from the Association of European Journalists in Vienna. And she's asking, what do you think of the influence of Elon Musk on President Trump, how to cope with it, and ban X, for example? So that's one question. Maybe I'll let you answer and ask the second one afterwards. Well, actually, the second one from Masato is also on America's influence. So what was your first thought on Vance's speech on democracy at Munich?
Well, I mean, I was shocked and surprised to read this speech. I didn't listen to it, but I read then in media. And as I said, actually, I mean, it's the extreme right political position. It's very strange sort of dictatorship in a way, talking to democratic Europe about freedom and democracy, at the same time not allowing in the White House journalists of the editions which didn't change the name of Mexican Gulf. So I mean, there is an element of hypocrisy in this. There is a lot of cynicism. And I think Elon Musk became a disappointment for the whole thinking world. And the influence, for the moment, I think he has a huge influence on Trump. And obviously he wants to have more influence because he wants access to secret financial information of the American state, etc. As far as I know, he was not given yet permission to get access to the data. But I think it's a very dangerous personality now in American politics. And since he is not a politician, and well, Trump is businessman first of all, and then politician. So I mean, this combination can be both dangerous for the outside world and for the democratic future of America.
Yes, and there's a third question from the audience from Sally Wellborn. She says, after the mini summit in Paris yesterday, what kind of unity do you think will be shown by Europe and Ukraine? Will Europe be able to show some unity, which until now is not really the case?
Well, in the end, I think if Europe wants to remain European Union and to have a joint vision of the future, they should decide, because if they decide not to continue support for Ukraine, I think it will make wider cracks in the European Union. And we know already that there are countries who are more close to Russian point of view. I mean, Hungary, Slovakia. There are many Greek politicians who are trying now sort of to persuade Greek government to give less help or to stop help to Ukraine. So, I mean, Europe is very different, and every country has its own sort of position. But it's very important that the main European leading countries remain the core of the European Union, and this core should have heart for Ukraine. I am talking about France, Germany, and Italy. And actually, Italian Prime Minister is still, I think she's still supporting Ukraine and very adamant about the American last decisions and statements.
Yeah, Giorgia Meloni definitely is still supportive for Ukraine, but she also claims being a good friend of Elon Musk and Donald Trump. So at some point she might have to make choices. Going back to J.D. Vance's speech in Munich and the lesson he kind of made to Europeans on democracy, do you think that there are similarities between Vance's view on democracy and free speech and Vladimir Putin's view? This is a question asked by Masato Kimura from the audience.
Well, there is a lot in common, and there is a lot in common, I think, between Putin's and Trump's view on certain things. So for me, this is one of the main dangers. I mean, if they can find common language on the issues outside the war, outside the questions of the war, they probably will try to find a common language which will please both sides on the issue of the war in Ukraine.
A couple of questions. One is from Mathieu Collet. Mathieu is asking if there's a risk of extending the war into Georgia by exploiting Ossetia and Abkhazia in the same way as Russia did with the Donbass. Then there's one from Patrizio Jeretic. He said that he's appalled by the overwhelming occupation of the global communicational and information public space by the current American national capitalist narrative. We all that's implied there. How do you feel about this situation? Is it possible to counter it? And what's the role of intellectuals, artists, and media people there? And since we're talking about artists and intellectuals, Brindus Armanca from Romania is asking if Ukrainian writers, artists, intellectuals do support Zelensky's position regarding the future peace negotiations. So the Georgia aspect.
Well, I think at the moment there is no danger for the new war in Georgia because Russia decided to take control of Georgia by practically controlling or becoming friends with the new Georgian political elite. So they created practically pro-Russian political force, which is now in charge. And these people are saying that we don't want to provoke Russia. We will try to become friends, and maybe Russia will return the occupied territories. I don't believe it, and I don't think they believe it. But obviously, they don't want to be at odds with Russia. Ukrainian intellectuals mostly were not supporting Zelensky from 2019, and they were not voting for him. Some of them are critical, now openly critical of Zelensky, but majority decided that in the time of war, you have to support democratically chosen president, elected president, and elected political force. So I would say that they support Zelensky as a head of state, but not his separate moves and his separate decisions. He has still a large support of ordinary Ukrainians, up to 50%. And of course, I mean, since the war started when he was president, so he should be the one who will sign the end of the war, or who will take responsibility for the outcome of this situation. Notion of American capitalist behavior, or it was not popular until probably several days ago in Ukraine, because Ukrainians always wanted to see America as partner and helping hand, and the main democratic force, the world policeman who is punishing those who are not democratic, etc. But now with Trump actually demanding mineral resources from Ukraine as payment for the help that was already sent to Ukraine. So there are already critical notes in Ukrainian society, and some sad irony that that Ukraine actually is treated like a colony, either by Russia or by the United States. And do we have an answer to that? I'm not sure. I mean, of course, the Zelensky refused to sign the first version of this contract that was handed over to him in Munich by the head of the Treasury of the US. But it's difficult to predict what will happen next, because, of course, if there is not enough military help, Ukraine will find itself in a dire situation where Ukraine might to accept unpopular decisions.
There's a question that Jim Dingley, who is a translator from Russian and Belarusian, is asking you, how do you see the future of Belarus?
I have a feeling that Belarus as a state doesn't exist anymore. It is completely controlled by Russia, by Russian secret services. The Russian army is stationed there. Ukraine was attacked from Belarusian side, from Belarusian soil in 2022, which means that actually Lukashenko has no say, and he is tolerated by Putin because most of the things Putin wants, Putin gets from Belarus. But once Lukashenko is gone, the next person will be probably not a president, but the governor of Belarusian part of Russian Federation. And that will be a very sad moment, because then Russian Federation will have border with Poland and Lithuania. And Russian politicians said already many times that the question of Suwalki corridor, of the land corridor leading to Kaliningrad region, is still important for them, and they will come back to this question. So Belarus is in a very sad situation now, with Belarusian intellectuals and independent thinkers all emigrated to Poland or Lithuania. And the country, of course, has no opposition and no political positive prospect unless Russia drastically changes.
Actually, I would like to ask you whether you also consider, I mean, what's your own point of view on this? Do you consider
Well,
Russians?
the only victims of this war are Ukrainians. And actually, Russians don't use mobilized forces. So people who go to kill Ukrainians, they sign contract in order to earn money. There are some ideologically sort of driven people, Russian nationalists, who join Russian army in order to kill Ukrainians for the ideological reasons. There are many neo-Nazis, Russian neo-Nazis in the Russian army. But there are not so many people who were forced to fight against Ukrainians against their will. So I can understand that actually that Russians living abroad, they feel shamed, or they feel that they are criticized or looked down because they are Russians because of this war. It's a collateral damage. I mean, in this situation, it's fault of Putin. It's not fault of Ukraine. So if you represent your country, if you are proud of Russia, and actually most of Russians, they are used actually to be welcomed everywhere in the world, because everyone is fond of Russian literature, of Russian ballets, of Russian painting. So actually Russians enjoyed over decades good treatment and special treatment. And now suddenly, actually, there are people who say that you shouldn't listen to Tchaikovsky, you shouldn't praise Dostoevsky, because he is also partially responsible for the attitude of Russians towards justice, for example, towards responsibility. So, I mean, there is an idea that this term, mystical Russian soul, was invented by Dostoevsky as an explanation why Russians are different, and why it's different way of life and treatment of crime and punishment in Russia. So I can understand that they can be upset and they can be anti-Putin, but at the same time, I didn't see protests of Russians abroad against the war in Ukraine, against Putin, against Russia killing Ukrainian civilians and bombing the cities and infrastructure. I do hope that this war will be over. I am realistic. I know that the practically hundreds of thousands of killed people created the wall now between Russia and Ukraine, and this wall will be very high, and Ukrainians will be trying to hide from Russia behind this wall for decades. So we are talking about generations before change of generations before there will be conversation of possible appeasement or some kind of contacts with Russia. But I mean, Russia now, by this war, isolated Ukraine from itself for dozens of years, if not forever, because I mean, this will stay in the memory. The graves of the Ukrainian civilians and of Ukrainian soldiers will define the attitude of Ukrainians towards Russia and Russians.
what is the invasion's impact on the construction of Ukrainian national identity?
Well, I mean, the main discourse is that Putin helped to reshape Ukrainian identity. He helped to consolidate the nation by attacking Ukraine, because suddenly everybody understood that we have one enemy. This enemy wants to destroy Ukrainian independence and Ukrainian identity, and we have to get together. And this consolidation actually lasted effectively for more than a year in the beginning of full-scale invasion. I mean, Ukrainian society is less consolidated now, but the identity is still there, and everybody understands what does it mean to be Ukrainian. Finally, also in Europe, a lot of people start understanding the difference between Russians and Ukrainians, and this is a historical difference, and it is shown in difference of mentalities, because Russians are collective people who are used to monarchy, to one-man control. I mean, the Soviet Union was the same Russian Empire, where instead of Tsar, we had general secretaries, which were re-elected until they died, except for one person, Nikita Khrushchev, who was dismissed and punished for his uprising against Stalinism. But today's Russia is also, I mean, it's empire of Putin, who is already 23 years in power and who will remain in power while he lives. So, I mean, Ukrainians never accepted this kind of political control of one person, one group, one party. That's why we have already president number 6, while Russia is still with Putin at the head. So, and Ukrainians are individualists because they never had royal family. They were ruling their territory in 17th century by choosing the head of the territory, head of state, who was called Hetman. They were anarchists from the very beginning because everyone thought that he or she, but mostly he, of course, it was a patriarchal society, that everyone has a voice and everyone can influence the politics in Cossacks Ukraine. And this came back, actually. I mean, the best probably proof of this individualist mentality is the presence of more than 400 political parties registered in the Ministry of Justice of Ukraine, because everyone who wants to go into politics in Ukraine creates his or her new party instead of joining already existing parties. This is what very important to know, to see the difference between Russia and Ukraine, and to see one of the reasons why Russia attacked Ukraine, because, I mean, Ukrainians are giving bad example to Russians. And Putin wants to keep Russians under control, and he does manage to do it. I mean, those who were not happy with Putin, they had to leave the country, or they were pushed out of windows, or they are in prisons now. So, I mean, the majority which is in the country, they are supporting Putin. They believe his words that they are more moral, more religious, more spiritual, and better people than everybody else in the world, and that they should actually conquer Ukraine back, because Ukraine was a part of Russian Empire from 17th century, with short break in 1918 and 1919, when actually Ukraine, after the 1917 October Revolution, announced its independence and tried to stay independent as long as it was possible during this so-called civil war.
Yeah, now you described quite well some specificity of the Ukrainian character compared to the Russian one, and also does this specificity also reflect in the Ukrainian literature, and does it explain also the will to defend this Ukrainian culture that Russia or the Kremlin wants to destroy?
Well, Ukrainian culture is in a bad state now because of the war. Because actually on the second level, it is a war against Ukrainian identity. It is a war to make Ukrainians Russians, to force them to assimilate, to accept Russian language as their mother tongue, and then to accept Russian culture and Russian history as their own history and culture. And so, I mean, I was just today thinking that it's more than 1,200 cultural objects that were destroyed by Russians in the last 3 years. We lost more than 1,000 culture-related Ukrainian activists and people, actors, composers, film directors, writers, poets. More than 100 of poets and writers were killed in this war. So, I mean, we'll have lots of objects of arts that will be never created because of these deaths. We don't have many writers who write now novels. I mean, most of writers write about the war, non-fiction, diaries, articles, essays. So we have a huge bulk of war-related literature and practically very few novels. The result is that I think 80% of the fiction market is now consists of foreign translated novels. So Ukrainians are very active readers, and the publishers are trying now to translate as much as possible because there is not enough written inside Ukraine for the book market.
Can literature be a good path to assert one's culture? And if so, why?
Well, I mean, literature was always an instrument to get acquainted to another society, to do different people, to different traditions, to different ideas. And now, for example, Ukrainian historical nonfiction is playing a very important role explaining to foreign readers the history of the Russian-Ukrainian relationship and the reasons for this war. And I hope that there will be more modern literature from Ukraine translated into European languages so that at least young readers could quickly absorb the differences and get interested in life of Ukrainian society during the war and before the war and after the war. One thing is very sad that during the last 100 years, practically not a single book from Ukrainian classical literature was translated into European languages. I talked to some publishers last year and the year before last, and I was surprised because some of them said that they never heard that actually Ukraine had classical literature, because they were sure that in the Soviet time and before there was only Russian classical literature on the territory of Russian Empire or of Soviet Union. So now some small publishing houses are catching up, but they have very limited capability and they print small numbers of copies. But I mean, it is happening, but it is happening for very, very limited number of interested people. I mean, like there is a French translation of one of the books of Lesia Ukrainka. It's a classical Ukrainian writer, poet, and playwright. And in German, there is a new edition of Ivan Franko, who was a very prolific writer, he was Ukrainian, living in Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and or even being a professor and politician at that time. So I mean, there are lots of gaps to be filled in Europe in order to understand today's Ukraine. Because, I mean, if you don't know the past of the country and you read a book written by a modern writer from this country, so you see only, I would say, flat picture, not 3D. You don't see the development of this society or the historical phases through which this society went until it reached today's reality.
Yes, there's a question from the audience from Irina Nedieva, who is from the Bulgarian National Radio and also a fellow from the Association of European Journalists. And it's about culture also. So she asked if there are any efforts on the Ukrainian side to keep people from the temporarily occupied territories somehow informed or still integrated to the Ukrainian identity and culture and news environment.
Well, unfortunately, it is impossible. And we have even, I would say, worse situation when the internally displaced persons from the occupied territories who were on Ukrainian side and they were helped by the state, by different programs, but they were not receiving enough help and they were going back to their houses on the occupied territories, losing their contact, because I mean, in some places not far away from the front line, I mean, the people who live on the occupied territories can listen to Ukrainian radio, even can tune to Ukrainian television somewhere, but generally the territory is completely under control of Russia. And Russians are brainwashing actually the population on the occupied territories. The schools are running according to the Russian program, and the patriotic upbringing is playing very important role. Actually, the teachers are telling and teaching the kids there, Ukrainian kids, how to hate Kyiv, how to hate independent Ukraine. And in this situation, unfortunately, not much that can be done by the Ukrainian government or Ukrainian NGOs.
Okay, we were asking ourselves the question of multilingualism in Ukraine, where both languages were spoken, and things, of course, I think, at least in the non-occupied territories, that is probably changing, as you wrote. And what's the future? Is there a future for multilingualism in Ukraine and for the Russian language and culture in particular?
Oh, I mean, in Ukraine, people speak about 15 languages. And of course, the largest groups speak Ukrainian and Russian. Many of Russian speakers were killed in Donbass by Russian missiles and drones, like in Mariupol. There were lots of civil population killed in Akhtirka, in other places. A lot of Russian speakers became refugees abroad. I met them in France, in Montpellier, in Germany, and I'm not sure they will be going back. So the number of Russian speakers after this war will be probably 2-3 times smaller than before the war. The young generation of Russian speakers, I mean, many of the young people, they switched into Ukrainian because, I mean, Russian became, in the thoughts of many Ukrainians, the language of the enemy. And although still, I mean, there are cities, big cities like Odessa, Kharkiv, Dnipro, where almost majority speaks still Russian, but I'm talking mostly about middle and older generation of Ukrainians. And the younger generation is either bilingual or sometimes still Russian speaking, but many of the people, young people, are turning to Ukrainian language in order to show that they are not Russians. And this tendency is going on. Of course, I mean, also for Russian language writers and poets, it's not a very easy time because they feel marginalized. The bookshops don't want to sell books in Russian, even if they are published in Ukraine. So the publishers practically stopped publishing books in Russian. And so the Russian language writers are publishing at once the translations into Ukrainian. But we should always remember that we have Crimean Tatar minority with Crimean Tatar language and literature and culture. We have a large Hungarian-speaking minority in Transcarpathia with several dozens of writers and poets. And actually one of the best Hungarian language writers, Timea Shrek, she lives in Ukraine, in Beregovo, and she writes about her region, which is part of Ukraine. So I hope that Ukrainians will try to learn more about the minority cultures which are active in Ukraine.
So there is a question from Julie Wizierki. I'm sorry if I scorch your surname. She's asking, we're still talking about culture and multilingualism. What are the cultural relations between Ukraine and Poland? She points out that part of Western Ukraine, the region that Lviv is a kind of capital, was Polish before the Second World War. So what are the cultural relations now?
Well, political relations are complex. Human relations are excellent because Poland was the first country to open the borders in the beginning of full-scale invasion. and Poland at that time took 1.5 million Ukrainian refugees. I think most of them are still in Poland. Before the war, cultural cooperation was very good, and actually some Ukrainian writers had more readers in Poland than in Ukraine. And well, it's because actually the cultural market or national cultural space in Poland is much stronger. And Ukraine had always problem with cultural national space because part of Ukraine culturally was controlled by Russia. I mean, like Donbass was reading Russian newspapers and magazines, watching Russian TV, reading Russian writers, not Ukrainian writers. And this was very obvious for many, many years before the war. So I would say the space for Ukrainian culture was rather limited in Ukraine, but Ukrainian literature was very welcomed and is still very welcomed in Poland. And for example, Jurko Andruchovich, one of the leading novelists in Ukraine, he had all his books first published after Ukrainian original. First translations were always in Poland, and he was always invited, and he had lots of collaborations with Polish rock bands, with Polish publishers, with Polish intellectuals. And it can be said about a good dozen of Ukrainian authors who feel themselves at home in Poland with Polish readers. So on this literary front, the situation remains very positive. We have issues on political historical front, if one can say so, because as you know, there was a very acute animosity between ethnic Ukrainians and Poles in 1942-43, when Volyn tragedy happened, when Ukrainians were killing Poles and Poles were killing Ukrainians. And this book is still open. I mean, the Ukrainian historians recently signed a public appeal to solve this problem, to accept that both sides were guilty, and to just to say sorry, and to not to forget it, but just to not to use it in politics, this historical tragedy. And I hope that it will work this time, because, for example, the Ukrainian government allowed this year to exhume the graves of the killed Polish peasants in Volyn. And that is a way to appeasement, to sort of solving this problem.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Laura, who was asking, what can we read in Italian or English for a better knowledge of Ukraine?
To know more about Ukraine's history, I would suggest Philip Sen's wonderful book, East-West Street, which is also published in Italian. It's about actually Western Ukraine between First and Second World War, and during and after the Second World War. But it's a very interesting non-fiction book that reads as a novel. Another interesting book is Martin Pollack's, who is published by Roberto Keller Editore in Italy. He's an Austrian professor who unfortunately recently died of cancer, but he's a historian. He was a historian and specialist on Ukrainian history and on the history of Eastern Europe. And he wrote a wonderful book, which is called, I think, The King of America, about the history of the emigration from Galicia, from Western Ukraine, and from Bukovina to Canada and America. There is another excellent book by a Canadian professor, historian of Ukrainian origin, Sergei Plokhy, The Gate of Europe. And I think this book is translated in most of European languages. And of course, I mean, if you want to know more about the tragedies like the artificial famine, it's worth reading Anne Applebaum's books, Red Famine, and the Timothy Snyder's excellent non-fiction book, Bloodlands. But the choice of books about Ukraine is now much, much better than it was 10 years ago. So there is a choice, and all these books are brilliantly written and very informative.
Thank you very much. Some of the books I managed to write down, and others I didn't. And Luisa Chiodi is from the media obesity. She said she wrote, I missed the first book mentioned. So maybe either we write them in the chat at the end.
Yeah,
it's difficult for us to write and moderate at the same time. But
it's Philip Sands. Philip Sands, Martin Pollack, Serhiy Plokhy, Timothy Snyder, and Applebaum.
About languages, there's another question asked by Christophe Collet. Is the language Esperanto represented in Ukraine?
Well, there was a club of lovers of Esperanto for many, many years. I don't know if it is active now. So there was a small group of enthusiasts who were promoting Esperanto and writing about it. Unfortunately, I didn't follow much their activities, and I don't know what is happening with this club today during the war.
There's a question I'm asking for Chris Baldwin. You're quoted to have said that Andrei Platonov's Chevengur taught you how to create literary worlds. Could you tell us a little more?
Yeah, when I was 17, 18, I was fascinated by the Russian Soviet writers from 1920s who were experimental, who were part of the so-called proletariat writers group, who were maybe not educated, but who thought that they should reform the language, and they were writing about the new Soviet reality. So they were using a lot of revolutionary imagination in their works. And Andrei Platonov was one of the best writers in this group. And one of his novel, Chevengur, is about creation of new society, which is like a literary answer to the Lenin's ideas that we should create a new type of a Soviet person that would have no ethnic roots, that would have just the same ideology, the same understanding of what kind of communist society they are building, etc. So probably Platonov wrote it as utopia, but it was read as a dystopia by me and by others, and probably now it looks more like dystopical novel. Yeah, I don't have much emotion now to this literature. It played a role in my young years as a writer, but I wrote myself several dystopian novels, and probably I was at that time under influence of Andrei Platonov. He had quite a sad destiny, actually. He published a lot of articles, several novels, but his books were not published for 30, 40 years after 1930s. And before his death, he was just a street sweeper working in the Writers' Institute named after Gorky in Moscow. So it's a sad and good example that when you serve ideology, then this ideology will turn you into nothing.
In your books, both your novels and your diaries, you never give up on humor and irony. Is this a way to survive also mentally to the war and the occupation?
Well, humor in the Soviet time was the best means to survive the Soviet regime. And it is still very important for the psyche of Ukrainians, because, if you don't have energy to smile or to find something funny, you can get depressed, and then you just you lose any desire to change things. You just accept whatever happens. In Ukraine, humor was always very important as this means of resistance. for Russia, satire was number one in this sense. I mean, the satirical Russian classical writers like Saltykov, Shchedrin were, in a way, very popular 150 years ago. And we should remember that actually humor was brought to Russian literature by Ukrainian Mykola Gogol. So I mean, Ukrainian tradition of humor is much more active, and I'm happy that actually this humor still exists, and there is a new soldiers' humor which was much more active and interesting in the first 6 months of the full-scale invasion, but it still exists. So people understand that actually humor is also something that can help to motivate people, to give them hope, and not to let them to become pessimists.
Merci. C'est une question un peu anecdotique, mais dans vos différents romans, Victor a été le seul héros présent dans 2 romans, Le Pingouin et Les Pingouins n'ont jamais froid. Et je voulais savoir si vous aviez jamais envisagé de faire rentrer Victor en Ukraine, et s'il était en Ukraine aujourd'hui, comment il vivrait la situation?
Well, in fact, actually, I wrote the sequel to The Penguin under pressure from German readers who accused me of being cruel to animals because there was no obvious happy end for Misha the Penguin in the first novel. I didn't plan to write the 3rd book, but I can imagine Victor if he would have returned to Kiev now after the events of the 2nd novel. I mean, in the first 2 novels, he was learning how to survive, not understanding first the new rules of life. But, I mean, he's an escapee, he's a survivor, and since he was shaped, his ideas and his attitude was to life was shaped in the most difficult 1990s, in the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think he would not change much. He would still try to escape the danger. He would try to find a safe place, also in today's Ukraine. Although, I mean, it's difficult to talk about safe places in Ukraine today because Russian missiles explode in every region of Ukraine.
I'm wondering, why do you think, after your opinion, why do you think that Russians who have been living abroad of Russia for 30 and plus years, why do they still support Russia, even though they are integrated in local society, having children, going to kindergarten schools, having mixed marriages, going to work, I mean, sitting next to locals, knowing actually languages, literature, they still support Russia? And this is the first question. And the second one, we are asked to feel sorry for Russians, to understand them, that they are also in difficult situation. And I feel this tendency will be stronger when the war is over. And it's already difficult to cope with this. How do you think? Do you have any thoughts about that? How do we handle it? Because we still try to convince local European society to see our point of view. And they do see it, but they also want us to support Russians.
Yeah, about the first question, actually, I don't know the correct answer because I think it's something almost genetical. It can be fear of somebody coming in the night, like in 1937, 1936, because, I mean, yes, Stalin is back in Russia. There are new monuments to Stalin. Stalin, a hero again. Today I read that the Museum of Gulag Prison, Perm 36, sent humanitarian aid to Russian soldiers in Ukraine. So, I mean, it's completely surreal that those who were trying to keep the memory of the victims of Stalin's gulags are now helping Russian army to kill Ukrainians. But yeah, there are other reasons for Russians in the West, living in the West, to continue to support Putin. Is it their sort of pathological love for everything Russian and for Russia, or do they feel ostracized or like isolated by the Westerners because they are Russian and this is their reaction and revenge? It's difficult to say, yeah. The second question, yes, in the West, a lot of people see both Russians and Ukrainians as victims of this war. And I was surprised that, for example, the Dutch government created a financial foundation to help Ukrainians and Russians who found themselves in difficult situations because of this war. Of course, the Ukrainians were appalled by this. But this is the reality, because in the West, many politicians consider Russian people victims of Putin as well. So it's different attitude. It's difficult to understand this attitude, but I came across many times in the conversations this idea that Russians are also victims of this war.
Andrei, you just came back from a quite long trip to India, where you met several people there, both intellectuals and also politicians and so on. How are the war and the situation in Ukraine and in Europe perceived over there? We often hear about this different perception in the global south of the stakes that are now being at stake in the war and in Europe.
Well, India, as you know, is a huge country with the biggest number of population in the world, 1.5 billion people, with about 30 different states. I mean, I visited only 2 states, Kerala and Karnataka, and I had a lot of meetings with university professors, with politicians, with local activists. And yes, it is a very difficult country for Ukraine and for Europe, because they consider themselves long-year partners of the Soviet Union. And for many Indians, actually, Russia is a Soviet Union in remaking. So they believe actually that Russia can become a new Soviet Union. It will be much stronger, and it will be a counterbalance to American influence. And they don't pay much attention actually to Ukraine. I cannot say that total majority feels like this, but actually there are intellectuals, there are university professors who understand the situation correctly and who are on Ukrainian side. But the ruling class, the government, is very sympathetic to Russia. And in this situation, Ukraine has to work hard to win sympathy and to win some, at least minimal support from the Indian society. You know that India has been buying Russian arms and ammunition for decades. And actually they were buying until recently Russian oil, helping Russia to get money. And this oil was then sold to Europe by Indian middleman companies. So I don't know if this process is going on or it was stopped because of the Trump's threats to sanction India. But the country remains actually one of the, I wouldn't say allies, but the country which is not on Ukrainian side in this war.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrei, for this. For joining us today, and thank you everybody for attending and participating in this live event.
Many thanks to our subscribers and shareholders who make this possible and who make possible Voxeurop to stay independent. To all the others, don't forget to subscribe to our weekly newsletter and follow us on social networks. We're not on X anymore. And please consider subscribing or donating to support our work. You can register in the link that is being shared now in the chat to our weekly newsletter, which is available in English, French, Italian, and German. So thanks again, Andrei.
Thank you very much.